Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at our side event on the theme Achieving Sexual and Reproductive Rights and Climate Justice. So this event is organized by different partner organizations, that is ARO, the Queen Mary University, the Sexual Reproductive Health and Right Climate Justice Coalition, the Danish Family Planning Association. So thank you so much for joining us today. This event is obviously very important because we're discussing the intersection of sexual reproductive health and right and climate justice. This is something that is very crucial, especially in the developing countries where we continue to see the disproportionate impacts of climate change and how it affects marginalized and vulnerable groups. So that is why in our conversations that we'll be having today, we're not only going to look at the climate vulnerabilities that the marginalized and vulnerable groups face, especially women, girls, and other groups, but as well how different organizations that are present here are doing all the works that they're doing in their different countries and region to see how we could continue to advance sexual reproductive health and right and climate justice. So that's why I have a distinguished panel here who are well-versed, who are experts in their area, share the work that they are going to be doing or that they have been doing as far as advancing sexual reproductive health and right and climate justice is concerned. The first person I have is Deepa. Deepa is a senior program officer at the Asia Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women, that is ARO. So the program they do is building new constituencies for sexual reproductive health and rights that looks at the linkages of SRHR and other issues such as climate change, food insecurity, migration, conservatism, and conflict. The next speaker I have is Tara Daniel. Tara is the Senior Program Manager at the Women's Environment and Development Organization, which is WIDO. Tara leads WIDO's portfolio of work on feminist climate finance, supports women participation and leadership in climate negotiations, and advocates for gender-responsive climate policies, particularly working with the Women and Gender Constituency and Sexual Reproductive Health and Right and Climate Justice Coalition. Another speaker that we have is Chiaguze Ude from UNFPA. Chiaguze is the policy and advocacy analyst on climate change at the UNFPA, working on the intersection between sexual reproductive health and right and climate change through gender transformative adaptation approaches. He coordinates the Joint Working Group on Sexual Reproductive Health and Right and Climate Change. Another speaker we have is Dr. Natasha. Natasha is a medical doctor and global public health researcher who has been working on at Queen Mary University in London on a partnership with the UNFPA. She worked on the NDC review we will be discussing. And our next speaker is Lena. I want to get it right. So she is the climate and gender advisor at the Danish Family Planning Association, working on board program management, global advocacy within the intersection of climate, gender, sexual reproductive health and right. And our final speaker is Dr. Ahmad Odwa. Ahmad is a medical doctor based in Egypt and a youth expert in sustainable development. He has 4 years of experience working in different UN agencies and youth constituency. During the COVID pandemic, he was selected for the task force of the UN Women Regional Office for Arab States, and recently he was selected as the contact point for the Younger Action for Climate Empowerment Working Group. He's also one of the youth reviewers of the NDCs of UNFPA. And finally, I'll introduce myself. I am Fatou Jeng, member of the United Nations Secretary General Advisory Group on Climate Change, and I was also one of the youth reviewers of the UNFPA NDC review for Western Central Africa. So this is why this event is very important for me, and I believe all the participants here, because sexual and reproductive health and right has been an issue that has more or less been neglected most of the time during the climate negotiations, during our national policies, or just the conversations that we've been having over the years. And I think this is a really important and critical issue that we need to start incorporating in our national policies, etc. Because even when I was reviewing our NDC for Western Central Africa, it was really sad to see that most of the countries did not even have sexual and reproductive health and right mentioned in our national policies. So this is something that is really alarming and something that is critical, because I believe, as I always say, there is no climate justice without gender justice. So these are things that go hand in hand, because at the end of the day, the impacts of the climate crisis is going to affect the most vulnerable groups. And if we do not really address these things hand in hand, then we might have lapses in terms of how well we're able to effectively address the problems that we're facing. That is why my first question will obviously be focused on the intersection between sexual reproductive health and right and climate. And I'll start with Deepa. So ARA has been a long-standing leader in this space. So can you please provide us, with an overview of the intersection between the sexual reproductive health and right and climate change that you've been witnessing in the Asia-Pacific region?
Thank you so much, Fatu, for that. So the Asia-Pacific region is at the forefront of experiencing the impacts of climate change and its related disasters. So most countries in the region are actually very vulnerable to climate risk and disasters, and this is according to the most recent IPCC report. So based on the report, many countries in this region are at the top of the most vulnerable countries in the world. And according to estimates by the UNFPA Asia-Pacific Disaster Report in 2019, the region has an annual loss of 675 billion due to climate-induced disasters. So the ramifications of climate change also has an impact on food security and trigger conflicts over key resources such as arable land, water, food and energy sources. However, while climate change impacts everyone, it is not a gender-neutral phenomenon, and it disproportionately impacts women and girls in all their diversities and gender-diverse communities. So despite being inextricably linked, their sexual and reproductive health and rights gets further deteriorated due to the deprioritization during humanitarian crisis, which we can also see was quite evident during the COVID-19 pandemic. Based on our studies with our partners in the region, some of the impacts of the climate crisis on SRHR includes, but are not limited to, the lack of access to comprehensive sexuality education, child, early and forced marriages, zero or limited access to SRH services during climate disasters, limited mention of gender, and the exclusion of SRHR in national plans and policies, and finally, the exclusion of marginalized communities and their lived realities in decision-making spaces. Though there have been systemic efforts to implement comprehensive sexuality education in many countries in the region, there are still barriers and challenges to implementing it in the curriculum. This is due to cultural norms and stigma. So this becomes even worse in the context of climate disasters for young people, especially girls who lose access to education. For example, in Nepal, parents tend to withdraw their daughters from schools so that they could either help out at home or in the farm or find a job to supplement the household's income during the increasing economic hardship experienced by the family during these disasters. This then further limits their access to information, including CSA. The effects of climate change are also an indirect driver of child marriage in the region, despite being recognized as a harmful practice. So when extreme weather events, they destroy livelihoods, the financial distress of local communities and families lead them to consider marrying the girl children as a coping strategy. So marriage at this young age increases the risk of early pregnancy, which makes the girls more susceptible to reproductive health complications. This includes placental tears, obstruction to the time of delivery, and even maternal mortality. So when vital infrastructure, such as clinics and highways, are disintegrated during the extreme weather events, this is especially floods and landslides, this then, further obstructs the sexual and reproductive health services. And this leads to the death for girls and women who are displaced during climate disasters. These disasters hit women and girls even harder over both the immediate and long term, as they are often poorer than men and yet may have larger burdens of care. Separately, disaster relief packages and humanitarian aid provided during the climate extreme events lack comprehensive sexual and reproductive health and rights needs of women, girls, and gender diverse people. This includes urgent ones such as services for pregnancy complications. For example, in the Maldives, healthcare services are not available in all islands. For women living in the outlying islands where SRH services are not available, they have to travel to another island that offers these services and has gynecologists. However, during harsh weather conditions, sea travel is unsafe and sometimes impossible. So this often results in pregnant women with either pregnancy or delivery complications being unable to access timely health services. In recent years, many countries in South and Southeast Asia have natural disaster response plans and policies. However, in many of these policies and plans, gender and SRHR are significantly limited or explicitly excluded. Many of these domestic policies emanate from key international commitments, and there are efforts to mainstream gender in the national policy frameworks. However, the benefits have not trickled down, and gender-based inequalities in the climate change context exist at the grassroots level. For example, in our national policy frameworks, key gender-specific issues such as sexual and reproductive health, disability, and gender-based violence get skipped very easily from the planning processes and are often traded off with competing priorities. So despite the many disadvantages that women in all their diversities face in this region, these experiences are not even considered in decision-making processes, specifically climate-related discourses and decisions. There is hardly any recognition of bodily autonomy and access to SRH services, and these are integral to gender equality and in building climate-resilient societies, including vital international spaces such as COP. So hence, comprehensive SRHR is largely missing in climate-related discourses, programs, and implementation at all levels despite the need. In addition to this, these discourses and decisions have failed to take into account the impacts of climate change on the gender-diverse community who are frequently marginalized in the region. This is as the diverse genders beyond the binary of heteronormity are not acknowledged legally in the region, thus neglecting their needs in climate action policies and programs. Separately, and finally, the dominating but damaging population control narrative is a huge challenge, as the focus on contraception to reduce population growth for the reduction of greenhouse emission is a false narrative. The population control approach for climate adaptation is still proposed by some stakeholders, despite there being studies that have shown that it is human consumption, fundamentally controlled and driven by the world's elites, not the reproductive behavior of poor populations, that is putting the survival of our ecosystems and humanity at the greatest peril. Although least developed nations have higher population growth rates, their citizens contribute to the least to global carbon emissions on a per capita basis, while they bear the disproportionate burden of the impact of climate change on the health of the planet due to overconsumption by wealthy countries and inefficiencies in productions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that really detailed intervention. I'm glad you mentioned not only the impact, climate change has on sexual reproductive health and right, but also provided, some of the recommendations, especially in terms of how we could ensure sexual reproductive health and right, especially comprehensive sexual reproductive health and right education is incorporated in our national policies and also trickling down into the implementation of some of these policies that have been mentioned. So I'll move on to the next person, that is Lena. So the Danish Family Planning Association has also been an actor in this particular space for many years. So being part of the Global Sexual Reproductive Health and Rights Federation and working directly with partner organizations in the Global South, could you please tell us, a bit more about the work that you do and how sexual reproductive health and rights organizations work with your organization? So in 5 minutes, you went beyond time. I'm going to time now.
Thank you so much, Fatu, and thank you for giving me the word. I'll try to make it short and sweet, and maybe there will be a few replications from what Deepa just shared. But thank you for this question, Fatu, and thank you for everyone that is here today, online and in this room. Before answering your question, I would like to acknowledge the co-organizers, Queen Mary University and Arrow, as well as the SRHR Climate Justice Coalition, and other distinguished representatives joining the panel. Thank you for sharing your work today and for welcoming me as a newcomer into this space. So warmly, I'm very honored to be part of this panel. So as shared by Deepa just before, we are here today to share insights on and highlight the importance of SRHR and gender in relation to climate action. The climate crisis is a gendered crisis. It affects women, girls, and other marginalized groups more than others, and ensuring sexual and reproductive health and rights and gender equality are therefore key to adaptation and resilience efforts. There will be no climate justice and sustainable development without gender equality and sexual and reproductive health and rights. For those of you that do not know the Danish Family Planning Association, we are a health and rights organization working in Denmark since 1956, and for the last 20 years also in the Global South. We are a member of the International Planned Parenthood Federation, with whom we share our joint vision of a world where all people are free to make choices about their sexuality and well-being without discrimination. And let me assure you that this vision is threatened by climate change. Every day we see how climate change negatively impacts sexual and reproductive health and rights, especially for women and girls and other marginalized groups. This includes, but is not limited to, as Deepa said, lack of access to services, which have real and profound effect on the health and well-being of people. We see higher maternal mortality rates and increased rates of gender-based violence, as well as disruption to education, employment, and entrenchment of structural inequalities for already marginalized communities. And at the same time, as Deepa also mentioned, we have over the last decade also seen this dangerous narrative take shape that links SRHR to climate crisis in terms of population control as a mitigation strategy. The overpopulation argument is that one of the key reasons for the climate crisis is that there are too many people on the planet, which is driving resource scarcity and biodiversity loss. This narrative sometimes translates into strategies of providing women and girls access to education and family planning in order to manage demographic trends and population size, and thereby carbon emissions. But such narrative is deeply problematic and wrongly places the responsibility of climate crisis on the shoulders of those communities least responsible for the climate crisis, and this is not acceptable. So what do we do to combat these challenges? As mentioned, DFPA works with communities and civil society organizations in the Global South, especially in East Africa. And together we fight for the realization of sexual and reproductive health and rights for all, including access to the full range of comprehensive sexual and reproductive health services and rights. We strive to combat negative gender norms and stereotypes through a gender transformative approach, as it is often rigid gender norms in society at large, within health institutions and within the private sphere, that prevents access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. And at the same time, we team up with others to facilitate access to green jobs and demand that people affected by climate crisis, and in particular women, young people, and marginalized groups, are meaningfully engaged in adaptation, planning, and implementation. And we see the effects of the efforts. Communities where we work become more resilient, more equal, and healthier. Solutions are more sustainable, both for people and the environment. We document both the negative impact of climate crisis as well as the positive changes we see where we work, and we use this evidence to mobilize decision makers in the countries where we work and in global negotiations. The Danish Family Planning Association pushes decision makers to be accountable to human rights commitments and justice at global negotiations related to women's health, education, and climate change, such as these Bonn negotiations, but also at the Commission of the Status of Women. Sexual and reproductive health and rights are critical for advancing gender equality and for overcoming marginalization, and thus for strengthening individuals' and communities' resilience and capacity to adapt to the climate crisis. Sexual and reproductive health and rights should be an important consideration in measures aimed at enhancing resilience to both slow onset impact of the climate crisis and its more immediate effects. We want to see just and sustainable solution to the climate crisis. We want to see gender equality and SRHR for all, both are fundamental human rights and key aspects of climate justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lena. I think you've mentioned really important and key points talking about the work that the Danish Family Planning Association has been doing in ensuring that sexual reproductive health and rights, is incorporated in climate policy as well as, the actions that you've been doing. And you've mentioned really key points that, if, sexual reproductive health and rights is incorporated in, climate change issues, communities are going to be more resilient. And that is what we need. Building the resilience of communities to adapt to climate change is very, very crucial as far as, the issue of climate change in general is it's actually concerned. And I'm happy to hear about, the issue of, sexual reproductive health and rights, again, reiterated by you that it's important that it is incorporated also in our national policies. And that will bring me to the issue of sexual reproductive health and rights and climate policy itself for my next speakers, that is Chair Guze and Ahmad. So, Chair Guze, UNFPA has recently reviewed the national determined contributions to better understand how sexual reproductive health and rights is reflected. Can you please, tell us a little bit about the findings of this particular publication that you've made?
Yeah, thank you, Fatou. It's quite hard to go after the two speakers already. There's quite a lot that I've already said. I'll just try to build upon that. As we know, there's a policy gap in terms of how this intersection is captured or covered within the various national climate policy documents, be it the NDC or the NAPs. We have more submissions for the NDCs, so it's natural that we had a focus on the NDC to see how it captures these intersections. Just to make the point that this study is not yet published, it's going to be published in the next couple of months, so we'll make sure to share it around and put the specific numbers for all of you to see, but it's still undergoing internal review. But we try to look at this across various thematics, as you see on your screen. We looked at the SRHR part, we looked at the gender, we looked at health, population dynamics, human rights participation, and vulnerable groups to see how the NDCs captured this. We did this review across 120 countries in 6 regions: East and Southern Africa, Western Central Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, as well as the Arab states, and Asia Pacific. And in each of the regions, it's quite interesting that we find some specific differences from when you go from one region to the other, how the various impacts are articulated and harnessed. Obviously, in general, there were quite some references, direct references to SRHR as listed here around maternal health, maternal and newborn health, around HIV, around GBV, family planning, SOGI, contraception, child marriage, other SRHR references, including SRHR information and awareness. But then there's also a difference on how these are integrated. What is substantive integration of these references, or what is a mere mention, a casual mention, or descriptive mention of these references? How many of them have budget lines? Which of them is describing impact, vulnerability, intervention, indicators? So all of this, we try to look at it through this stream to see how they were mentioned. And I could say that largely there's some progress from the previous, because this is the second review we are doing. From the previous one we've done, there's slow progress, but it's still nowhere near enough to what we need to make substantive change in the process. And the next one. And just to show a bit of, in terms of what we found, so as I mentioned, there's a small but increasing number of NDCs that include references to aspects of SRHR. We see clearly that GBV represents a key intersection of SRHR and climate change that should increasingly be reflected in the national climate policy, especially the NDC. That also we see that helping communities and vulnerable groups to realize SRHR helps to build the resilience and adaptive capacity to climate change. We see that countries are increasingly recognizing this, but there are still very few. There's obviously a huge gap in terms of documented evidence at the national level. This is something that we see coming from the countries. There's a number of countries that mentioned research in specific areas, and this is absolutely important that when countries are able to have this documented national level evidence. It helps to inform policy better. It helps to inform more targeted actions, and it helps the country to more easily integrate this into the various national climate policies. So this is an important gap, especially with the key date of the 2025, when we expect the next update of the NDCs to happen. I think this is very important to keep in mind that if we need to have national level evidence, we have to start now to work on it, to make it available by next year for countries to consider as they go ahead to update their NDCs. As I mentioned earlier, most of them did not include any budget lines or any costed intervention in their plans. It was just there and was not budgeted for. And this shows that, of course, it could mean that it's open for partners to support, but it also shows the level of priority that it has for the country. But overall, it does provide enough entry points for engagement. I think across board, whether it's from the gender angle, from health, or from specific SRHR reference, or even from the youth reference or human rights angle, there's a lot of entry points that you can expand to begin to engage in this processes at the national level. Even from the consultations that should happen for the NDCs itself, it's also an incredible opportunity to be able to bring these processes to the table. And one more point around the mention of the national gender and climate change focal points. Only a few countries did mention this in their NDC, and I think this is a very important area to look at, that we're able to engage the national gender and climate change focal points to build the capacity around this area. So this intersection should organically come through the ministry and be embedded across the policy lens that the country is preparing. And as I mentioned earlier, we see this notable difference as we go from one region to the. For example, in Eastern Southern Africa, they made a lot of mention around the impact on HIV. When you go to the Western Central Africa, it highlights conflicts intersection. If you go to the Latin American region, it talks a lot more about gender identities as well as environmental defenders as well. So you could see how the regions are trying to integrate this. So I could say a lot more about this in the subsequent round of questions, but I would leave it here for now.
Thank you so much. I still struggle with the mic, so my apologies if I try to speak on the mic and it's not really working. So Uday, thank you so much for sharing the key findings of the review that has been done, because these are really important aspects as far as integration of sexual reproductive health and right in not only our national policies are concerned, but also streaming it down or taking it down to the lowest level of the communities that are mostly affected or impacted by the climate crisis. I'm really looking forward to seeing UNFPA continue to engage young people to support in the implementation of this particular finding, as well as including the national agenda for focal points, as you've mentioned, because these are really also important stakeholders in ensuring that the ministries that really, or the governments, get these things implemented. So thank you so much, Cheguze, for that insightful presentation. So Ahmad, you were one of the regional youth reviewers on the analysis. So following up from the findings that has been shared by Uday, how, and also the findings that have been made by you, especially from your regional level, how do you see youth engagement and SRHR reflected in climate policies in your region?
Okay, hello everyone. So as you know, that is under my name is Yango, which is the Children and Youth Constituency of the UNFPA. So I won't be talking with a nice diplomatic language. No, I am here to fight for the youth demands. So let me take you first into my reflection about the Arab State region. Unfortunately, they didn't recognize the youth engagement and also the SRHR in their NDCs. So that's mean the SRHR, the youth, they are excluded from the national process. So they won't be having any commitments towards us. And plus, what I notice that they never mention about the gender equity, not all of them, but it's a few of them. But they didn't say it with the clear word SRHR and the climate change. And the problem that if we are not recognized officially, so we won't be in their map. So how are we gonna facing that? We need to have a collaboration between the youth, between the civil society, between the UN, between the government. We need to be in the process. We want to be recognized by them. This is actually the first step. The second step, some Arab countries, they are trying to already implementing the services of the SRHR and try to make it accessible, but still they having challenges. Okay, so if you are right now having challenges, so why you don't engaging the youth to bring up to you new ideas, new initiatives to facing and also accelerating that the developing in our region. Plus, some member states from the Arab region, they are implementing the SRHR, but they don't report back into the NDCs, which will take us into the lack of the capacity because they don't understand what is the relation between the SRHR and also the climate change. So that means we need to awareness them, increasing their capacity about the interlink, because I was talking to them and they said, oh, the SRHR, so what is the relation between them? So they was asking, so that means that they don't know. Even if they are implementing some actually plans or some local campaigns or increasing the capacity. So what I want to see in the future in our climate policy is having a youth engagement, having official recognition of the SRHR, having official and clear language with the gender equity. And yeah, this is from my actually a reflection. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ahmad. I think you mentioned really important issues. You know, the first step towards getting young people included in sexual reproductive health and rights and climate-related issues is recognizing us and the important role that we play in this particular process. So it's really good that, you know, you were able to find this out in your review, that young people, there is still a lack of representation and participation of young people in our NDC formulation and implementation process. So our recognition is quite key. And the second thing, actually, it's really disheartening to see that, our officials still do not understand the linkage between sexual reproductive health and rights and climate change. So that makes it really difficult, because if we don't understand the intersection and the connection it has, then, we have a lot of gaps in terms of, addressing or advancing climate justice as well as social justice or just environmental justice in general. So I'm hoping to see that, again, with the NDC review and the findings will be very important for our national agenda focal points and our ministries, because it will help them in also the capacity building that you have mentioned, which is very key as far as the work is concerned. So capacity building is also a very important tool as far as advancing this particular work is concerned. Thank you so much, Ahmad, for that. So Tara, I'll come to you. As a leader in the gender and climate space, you have been watching how sexual reproductive health and rights is being incorporated into the discussions related to climate change and gender. The coalition has also, recently reviewed how sexual reproductive health and rights is included in the Gender Action Plan and the Women Deliver. Also explored this particular insight into the national adaptation plans. So can you tell us how sexual reproductive health and rights can be reflected into the gaps and the NAPs? Because I think these are really important national policies that needs to have gender and sexual reproductive health and rights incorporated.
Absolutely, and thank you, Fatu. So first, it's important to note that the GAP and the NAPs are under this process we're following, the UNFPA. One's an adopted set of activities over 5 years for parties and other stakeholders. One's a party-driven process with guidelines from UNFPA decisions. But under the UNFPA, there's no explicit mention in any of the decisions of sexual and reproductive health and rights. Indeed, as we consider the intersections between SRHR and SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, it's important to note that the UNFPA texts have not made any mentions of gender beyond the male-female binary. So this is a multilateral process that we're in that provides a structure and guidelines for party activities and party processes on climate change. And so what we're looking at today is how there are possibilities for parties and other stakeholders to integrate SRHR. So first, the Gender Action Plan. Last year, the SRHR and Climate Justice Coalition, we put out before COP27 our ideas for how each of the activities under the GAP could be implemented with an SRHR lens. So prior to the midterm GAP review that happened at COP27, there were 20 activities in the GAP. The last two were monitoring and reporting that was really led by the Secretariat. So we had ideas for 18 of the activities and recommendations, looking at the goal and the potential that parties that are supportive already of SRHR could take on the implementation of these activities that they've committed to as part of the UNFCCC process. With an SRHR lens, and then that advocates could also direct their energies toward robust implementation of these activities. Let me give you a couple of examples. So activity A1 of the UNFCCC Gender Action Plan is strengthen capacity building efforts for governments and other stakeholders in mainstreaming gender in formulating, monitoring, implementing, and reviewing, as appropriate, national climate change policies, plans, strategies, and actions, including nationally determined contributions, national adaptation plans, and national communications. So as we're going to be talking about NAPs in just a few minutes, and as we just heard about NDCs, there are clear opportunities here for strengthening the capacity for linking SRHR and climate change planning, and strengthening that capacity not only at a technical level, but in thinking about processes that are actually engaging youth and communities and other voices that need to be a part of these national plans for them to have validity and accountability, as well as applicability to the depth of the climate crisis that we're facing. So activity B2, for example, promotes travel funds as a means of supporting the equal participation of women in all national delegations. And we proposed ensuring expertise in delegations in health and SRHR, just like the other thematic areas have their thematic experts. Activity D4, for the last example from the GAP, is supporting the collection and consolidation of information and expertise on gender and climate change in sectors and thematic areas, as well as identifying experts on gender and climate change and enhancing knowledge platforms on gender and climate change. So we know that data collection has to include SRHR. In fact, we have several coalition members right now that are engaged in research on the multidimensional connections between SRHR and climate change in specific sites. So we really hope that we can bring in this data and this evidence into this process and into these conversations. Long term, what we'd love to do is update this analysis of the GAP with examples and case studies of activities that have integrated SRHR that fall under the GAP. So if you know of something, please feel free to be in touch and connect with us. So let's turn to the national adaptation plans now. We know that SRHR is vital for adaptation, that its full realization strengthens resilience. So with NAPs, I want to point out that we actually have a UNFCCC decision on NAPs dating back to 2011 that specifies that in the development of NAPs, there should be continued promotion of participatory and gender-sensitive approaches coordinated with sustainable development objectives, policies, plans, and programs. So we just talked about the Gender Action Plan as an entry point for SRHR in the UNFCCC process because we have gender that's so well mentioned in the UNFCCC. And the SRHR and Climate Justice Coalition believes we can't have gender responsive approaches without considering and integrating SRHR. But I would mention that here we've got this other potential entry point, which is the mention of sustainable development plans and policies, which could connect to health and SRHR in other ways as well. We would note, though, and this is an important aside, health is really an overlooked aspect of climate when it comes to the UNFCCC process. And the national adaptation plans are actually some of the best tools for recognizing that interlinkage with health overall, not only SRHR, as there are also health sector NAPs. So the NAP Global Network and Women Deliver have done really excellent work on surveying NAPs to find out if and how SRHR was being integrated into them. And I really recommend you read the report in full and note that it's available in French and Spanish too. So their first finding was all of the NAP documents identify health as a priority sector for adaptation. But their second finding was there's some attention to gender considerations in the health sector and adaptation planning documents. Followed by the third finding, here's limited attention to SRHR and overarching NAP documents. So we've got to do a better job of making these linkages so that we're not having this spectrum kind of fall away over time. Only 10 of the 19 documents that they reviewed contained any specific references to the components of SRHR that were included in their specific analysis. And their survey concludes with words I'm going to read verbatim, but with emphasis. All right. Gender responsive approaches present an entry point for consideration of SRHR issues in NAP processes by integrating gender considerations in an intersectional approach that addresses other factors such as age, race, and sexual orientation. We can emphasize the role that SRHR can play as a basis for climate action. So these are their words, the words of Women Deliver, the NAP Global Network. But this is really getting to the overall point of my remarks today. The possibility for the integration of SRHR in various UNFPA activities and processes really is facilitated by gender and these mentions of gender that we have within the process. We've got these many gender mandates, many places where gender-related activities and gender responsiveness are part of the process. So that's where we can hopefully continue to make the case ever louder and to the point that it can't be ignored that SRHR is vital.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much. I forgot the last two, but yeah, saying that, these things are really important to ensure that, sexual reproductive health and right is more or less final. And it's really important. You also mentioned the issue of, health, often overlooked in the UNFPA space, which is why the NAVs are really important policies that we could always look at in terms of how well to see we could integrate sexual reproductive health and right in our national adaptation plans. Thank you so much for sharing that policy document. I'm sure we are going to be able to make use of it in terms of seeing how we could advance this particular issue. So we're moving on to, almost the tail end of the event, but I'd like to ask Deepa how, ARO itself has been committed to ensuring systems, policies, and programs are reoriented to uphold gender equality and sexual and reproductive health and right. So can you please give us some recommendations, especially in the context of the work that ARO does?
Sure. So the list is not exhaustive. However, I can share some of the recommendations based on evidences from our studies. So firstly, there is a lack of understanding and gender disaggregated data regarding the impacts of climate change on SRHR. As such, more research on quantitative and qualitative data on how climate change impacts women and girls in all their diversities and gender diverse communities, particularly their health, is needed, as very little data and information are available in most Asian countries. This will inform the development of plans and policies that prioritizes climate resilient health systems that ensure SRHR services in times of crisis. The structural barriers embedded in norms, laws, and policies pertaining to SRHR that contribute to inequalities and injustice must be addressed. This includes recognizing the needs of women and girls in all their diversities and gender diverse people and providing sexual reproductive health services and facilities that cater to them. So policymakers must implement their commitments to gender equality and uphold SRHR when responding to the climate crisis. This includes ensuring inclusive, equitable, and meaningful participation of the most affected and marginalized communities in decisions related to climate change at all levels. This includes planning, development, and implementation and the monitoring processes. So this also includes ensuring participation, engagement, and representation of indigenous and marginalized communities with intersecting identities in negotiation and decision-making spaces, including at COP, to ensure gender and SRHR are reflected in all pillars of climate discourses. So voices from the region are disproportional and representation at various global platforms are limited. CSO's participation in key advocacy spaces are extremely limited and not equitable, as most only hold observer status and are excluded in the negotiations. Next, climate change, environmental and DRR policies and programs must be developed and implemented using an intersectional, equitable lens and a human rights-based approach. So this includes applying human rights, gender, and social justice-based approaches to climate action, and includes the full range of SRHR, and to commit to robust feminist and feminist financing for climate and SRHR intersections. Gender and SRHR needs to be integrated in climate change policies and strategies, including but not limited to the NAPs, the NEPAs, Local Adaptation Plan of Action, as well as, and to do this, we will need to break all the existing silos that is currently among climate change, human rights, gender experts, and humanitarian organizations. This also includes UN agencies working together to provide technical and financial assistance for gender-responsive climate solutions. And finally, the decisions at UNFCCC spaces, such as the Bonn and COP, must reflect demands of progressive CSOs with grassroots-specific knowledge that can contribute to gender analysis and policy development. The gender-specific needs of people or of diversified gender identities to adapt and build resilience to climate change needs to be prioritized. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deepa. It's really important, again, that you've mentioned that climate action needs to be equitable and also focus on a human rights approach, because if that is done, then every group affected or impacted is obviously considered. And the fact that you have mentioned that the issue of funding is always a challenge, and it's really important that feminist-led, women-led organizations are actually funded to ensure that the actions and the projects and the programs are implemented within the communities that are affected, because these are organizations and institutions that usually work directly with the most affected or the most impacted. And it's good that I've seen that in your recommendation. Natasha, I haven't really forgotten about you, So I'll move to you. Framing in the space is really important. And sexual reproductive health and right, and the CJ Coalition has just launched a messaging guide for how to think and speak about the topic. Can you please give us an overview of how this guide helps the reader to frame this particular intersection?
Thanks, Fatu. So the messaging guide supports better communication about the interlinkages between sexual and reproductive health and rights and the climate crisis. And it does this by providing people with the precise language with which they can think and speak about the topic, how to respond to common myths or attacks, practical actions we can take, and definitions of key terms and concepts. But at the core of the guide are 5 fundamental overarching principles or messages from which to understand the intersection. The first principle is that comprehensive sexual and reproductive health and rights are a fundamental human right. All people deserve access to the full range of SRHR, which encompasses aspects such as birth, family planning, sexual experiences, gender identity and expression, dignified menstruation, and these are essential to a just, healthy and resilient society. Reproductive justice, gender justice and climate justice are all interlinked and interconnected. Realising sexual and reproductive health and rights are critical to advance gender equality, health, well-being and overcome marginalisation. We advocate for a human rights-based approach for access to and realisation of SRHR for all. Secondly, bodily autonomy is climate resilience. Having control over one's body, what happens to it, what doesn't happen to it, free from coercion or violence, is essential for people's ability to adapt, respond and recover from climate shocks and extreme weather events. As well as being a human right in and of itself, bodily autonomy is a climate solution, as when people have control over their bodies, they can participate as full members of their communities in climate action. Thirdly, addressing intersectional inequalities and injustices is essential for achieving climate justice. The climate crisis has disproportionate and unequal impacts, as despite having contributed the least, women and girls suffer the most from its impacts. SRHR and climate is a place where we see an acute coming together of multiple forms of discrimination and heightened vulnerability, as situations of crisis exacerbate pre-existing gender inequalities and compound intersecting forms of discrimination against women living in poverty, Indigenous women, sexual minority, racial and ethnic women, women with disabilities, refugee and asylum-seeking women, internally displaced and stateless women, rural women and unmarried women, who all are disproportionately affected when compared to men and other women. Although adaptation programs may provide new employment and livelihood opportunities, failure to address these structural barriers faced by women in gaining access to their rights will only serve to increase gender-based inequalities and intersecting forms of discrimination, and hence why adopting an intersectional lens is essential to achieving true climate justice. Fourth, climate justice requires participatory and inclusive processes. The realization and achievement of comprehensive SRHR will not be possible if solutions, policies and processes replicate colonial practices. Any SRHR and climate justice initiative must address the racial, social and economic inequity of climate impacts and put the voices of those most affected at the heart of decision-making to ensure the solutions we create reflect the world we want to build, a world centered in rights and justice. Lastly, controlling women's bodies will not solve the climate crisis. As some of my panelists have mentioned, a harmful population narrative exists that it's our growing population that's resulting in increased carbon emissions, and therefore measures to reduce or limit the growing population can be weaponized as climate solutions, such as carbon offset programs that fund basic family planning to areas with high fertility rates in an attempt to reduce fertility. While this is both factually incorrect, so the carbon footprint of the world's richest 1% is nearly double that of the poorest 50%, it's also harmful, as it implies that if we limit the reproduction of some people, other people can continue to overconsume, which shifts the responsibility of the climate crisis onto the bodies of some of the most disadvantaged and marginalized people, who are the least responsible for the climate crisis. We need to be clear that the problem lies with our patterns of consumption and exploitation globally, not on women's bodies, not on population numbers, sorry. Rather than putting the blame and solutions to the climate crisis on women's bodies, to achieve climate justice, we need to acknowledge the true drivers of the climate crisis: extractive capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, militarism, patriarchy and racism, and the people and structures that uphold these systems of power to hold the right actors accountable.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Natasha. Wrapping up with the fact that, controlling women's body will not really solve the climate crisis, but holding the culprits and the perpetrators accountable is what will solve this. And the fact that you've mentioned the issue of patriarchy, that's one of the biggest challenges that we continue to face in our African society, which is obviously hindering the progress and the growth of women, especially the issue of gender equality, social justice, etc. So I'm looking forward to seeing people using this guide, because you've shared really insightful information here. So as we are about to almost wrap up, I will just ask all my speakers in 2 minutes to share or to tell us something that we all think is hopeful and positive in relation to the intersection of gender, sexual, reproductive health and right. Something that we really think or that we want to really see happening. So I will start again with you, Natasha. In 2 minutes, would you mind share that?
Sure. So something I think which is hopeful is that the intersection is beginning to gain increased visibility and attention, and in part due to more research and evidence that's coming through. So, for example, IPAS started collecting some data last year on women from Mozambique and Bangladesh, and there's also some research undergoing by them in Kenya at the moment about how women's experiences of climate change is negatively impacting their SRHR. But an element that wasn't mentioned in this research and that I would like to see more of is research and support for people of underrepresented sexual orientation and gender identity and sex characteristics, who often face multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, which are heightened in times of crisis. So we need to ensure that there's representation and inclusion of people of diverse SOGI in decision-making so that the world we create is rooted in sexual and reproductive rights and justice.
Thank you so much. The representation and the inclusion of marginalized and vulnerable communities in the decision-making processes is something that you would like to see, Natasha. So I'll move to Deepa. What would you like to see?
Thank you so much. So when we first started looking at the nexus between climate change, gender, and SRHR in the region almost a decade ago, there was barely any data evidence available. So even in the Paris Agreement, gender is only mentioned 7 times, and there is actually no mention of SRHR at all. However, now we are slowly, very, very slowly, seeing conversations around this nexus with stakeholders, including policymakers and CSOs, exploring gender-responsive policies and documenting this evidence on the climate change, on the impact of climate change on gender and SRHR. So though this progression is very slow, it is still very hopeful.
Thank you so much. The inclusion of gender-responsive policies is something that Deepa is really passionate or wants to see included. And she has been seeing at least a little bit of progress. So I'm hoping to see as well at least a massive progress on that issue. Lena, I'll move to you.
Well, you also asked for something that I was hopeful about. So I want to say that it's really positive to see that women and young people and other structurally excluded groups are coming together into the climate negotiation space. Maybe not so much in here, but at least outside and also a bit inside these rooms. This convening and organizing within global policy processes is hopeful. An example of this is the important work of the Women Gender Constituency and the SRHR Climate Coalition, Justice Coalition. Such networks provide tremendous support to women's rights activists, other structurally excluded groups, and civil society organizations. They provide intelligence, avenues for learning, and spaces to influence. And they practice their ideals of feminism, care, collaboration, and shifting the power and inclusion. I'm also hopeful that affected people, networks, and coalitions will finally be centered in climate action. It is their views and lived experiences that should guide climate action, leading to the change we urgently need to see. We need to see SRHR and gender included in climate policies and implementation, and we need funding that advances SRHR, gender equality, human rights for climate justice.
Thank you so much, Lena. You have mentioned really key and important issues, the issue of collaboration between youth, CSOs, women, etc., and the issue of funding, and also the increased participation of these different groups in the decision-making process is also shared by Natasha as well. Thank you so much. I will move on to Ahmad.
Okay, as actually a youth, what I hope to see is we want to be engaged in the national process with the real one. Not only just recognition into the nice paper with the nice diplomatic language. No, I want to be engaged in my national process. I want to developing my country. I want to work into my region. I want to fight for our rights because we are the future. We are the present. So if you are excluding the youth, so you're simply excluding the future. So you don't have future plans. Plus, we want a clear language that recognizing SRHR in the NDCs with the clear language. Like, we don't want to sneak around with the diplomatic languages. No, we want to directly that we are recognizing the SRHR and also the climate change. We want official and implementing the gender equity because in the urban state region, we are suffering from this topic, and unfortunately, most of the urban states are not taking real action because of the many regions. Fourth is increasing our delegation, is increasing the capacity building of our official delegation about the SRHR and why they are interlinkage between the climate change, why the gender equity is important to be addressed. So we need to even having a workshop for them or having a capacity session for them. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Ahmad is saying it should be clear, direct, and straight to the point. No beating around the bush, especially in the integration of sexual reproductive health and rights in our national policies. Thank you. And also, young people need to be included. We are not just there, just occupying the spaces. We are really key and important stakeholders in this entire process. So thank you so much. Tara, what would you like to see?
I'm going to start, like Lena, with what makes me hopeful right now. So we've been building for decades on the work of amazing feminist activists and advocates on this issue. But I do feel like we're in this moment of inflection where we're bringing together the networks, we're bringing together the evidence, we're bringing together the communications. And so what I would like to see is us turning that into these very targeted advocacy strategies so that we can see the policies that we want to see and that we can see the policy implementation that we want to see of already existing policies, so that we can really move the needle from talking about the interlinkages on these issues to seeing how that's being operationalized and how that's being addressed by our policymakers.
We need to see our policymakers walking the talk. Yeah. Thank you so much, Tara. And last but not the least, Mr. Cheguze Ude, I'll give you the floor.
Yeah, I mean, there's little to add to what's already said. I would just say in terms of being hopeful, of course, as Natasha mentioned, it's really exciting to see that countries are increasing their integration of this aspect. It's really small in scale and in terms of substantive inclusion, but it's hopeful for us that we know we can do a lot more with more research to go. But also there are other opportunities also that we can explore. For example, the COP28 presidencies has a huge health agenda that they want to deliver at the COP28, and this is urging all the stakeholders in this room to really work on that agenda, make submissions as necessary, engage the presidency team to make sure that this is at the top of the table for the package that they are looking to deliver, both in terms of financing, but also in terms of the visibility, in terms of commitment from countries on especially looking at the key dates, the update of the NDC that is coming forward. I also think, hopefully not too late, that the global stocktake process, that we're able to make some progress within this to be able to highlight the gaps that we see, and this could be a solid framework or foundation for work that could be done on this afterwards. I think obviously financing is a key challenge. We need resources to do a lot of the work that needs to be done, the vulnerability assessment, the national level research. You need to speak to people who are impacted. You need to gather data. This obviously requires resources that are not available, and we need to scale. We need to scale the resources that are available and dedicated to this process. So hopefully we can be able to make a lot more progress on this, but it's great to see that we're coming together slowly and heading towards a specific direction.
Thank you so much, Cheguze, and also great job on the work that's been done by UNFPA, especially on getting more young people included in sexual reproductive health and rights issues. So we are about to wrap up. We have exactly 10 minutes to end up this conversation. And that is why we're going to open the floor to our amazing audience to ask any questions they have for our speakers. Yes.
Thanks, Nicole Hendrickson, Trinidad and Tobago. Any one of the panelists, if there's a country or region who's resisting having youth on their panel and resisting the sexual reproductive rights track, for want of a better phrase, how would you suggest they get on track?
All right. Thank you so much. So we'll just take it down. We just take the 3 questions, and then we're going to allow the speakers. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a very promising conversation. I'm called Charles Kaviso from Regenerate Africa. We integrated SRHR into our climate action. I like the conversation that we of course, even with the UNFPA research, but the biggest problem we are having is this is just a mention. If you read all those NDCs, there is actually no concrete action. Maybe probably apart from the recent NDC for Uganda, which actually explicitly comes up with the adaptation action on SRHR, even mentioning as an action. But you know, all of these are just mere like ticking the box. So I think the recommendation should be we need country actions to engage the NAP processes, the NDC processes with concrete action. And then the other problem, another issue is some countries have actually come up with the healthy NAP. Other sectors are running very, very fast, like agriculture NAPs. But you know, the healthy people, we are just sleeping and comfortable in our silo kind mindset. We don't see the things coming out. There is no way we are going to attract funding, especially big funding, if these are not, SRHR is not like a priority, the priority country adaptation actions. And we are also worried because we've got big sector organization like UNFPA. We have not had even a single project that connects SRHR and climate. So the people who are down at country level, we are even worried, is this a dream or we are just, because you would live by examples, but we don't see this coming out. Then we are also experiencing problems at country level where our SRHR, the R, is kind of sensitive at country level, even I think even in Arab, at least for my country in Uganda. So we find it a little bit sometimes hard to engage. And also there's a confusion on whether we should do advanced FP. Now you can see that it is a little more watered down. So maybe the question from the Danish Family Planning Association is FP under SRHR? Because, you know, organizations are a bit advanced, especially as conservation NGOs to embrace integration. But now certain language keeps on changing and we want to be consistent a little bit. Or we use it synonymously. So I think for me, those are typical concerns, and we are engaging, and I like the conversation. Hope it will take us somewhere that we want to be. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. This really goes very much along the same lines. I'm Vanessa from GIZ, working as a planning officer in the Competence Center Climate Change. And actually, the German Development Corporation has a huge focus on gender. There's a feminist development policy by BMZ, which is the development ministry. There's also a feminist foreign policy by the Foreign Office as well. So there's a huge focus now to really make gender not just having transformative, or to have not just gender sensitive or responsive, but rather even transformative projects, although it's really difficult to go this way. We've heard a lot of really interesting statements and it's all really, I think, a really, really important session, although don't worry that there's someone, I think most people, the day has been long. I think the topic is so important, but people probably are a bit tired. So, but anyways, but what I think is, I don't think the problem is really that it's not in, I mean, of course it should be included in more NAPs and more NDCs, yes. But at the end of the day, I agree with you that at the end of the day, we need concrete action on the ground. I mean, there's so many countries where there are the policy papers, they're there. That's not the problem. The problem is often implementation. So do you have any positive experiences of countries where you say, this has really worked, their sexual and reproductive rights have been really included in climate justice, in climate projects, and really to make a change? I mean, we only have a couple of minutes left, or if you can just give some links or some information, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So there is one that is addressed to the Danish Family Planning Association. The first question was open for any of the speakers, so we could start with that. And then also the second one, I think, was also addressed to Danish Family Planning Association on the issue of the framing of family planning. That's the second individual. So I'll start with a response to the first question. Do we have any?
I have a few high-level thoughts. Thanks, Nicole, for that question. How do we get a country on track? I do think that we have to set the new normative expectation that this is what gender-responsive work looks like. I think there's a lot of buy-in and commitment to the idea of gender equality that's been long fought and hard won, and so we have to make this a normative expectation that SRHR is part of this. I think some of the work that's been highlighted here helps to do that, putting it out there. Who's doing this in their NDCs, and getting also to this question of who's doing this on the ground, and being able to really communicate that and showcase that and spotlight that, because I do think that policymakers respond to what they can see and what they have seen demonstrated and what they're seeing that's being supported. I would also say that the capacity strengthening piece is really important, like capacity strengthening for policymakers, doing cross-sectoral work where we're making sure that we're making these connections between health and climate change, because I think some of this is a lack of vision and a lack of knowledge. And then lastly, continued connectivity for the advocates so that they can continue to raise up and to share these examples and to hold their policymakers to account. I think the role of civil society there cannot be underestimated.
Thank you so much, Tara.
Yeah, I'll try to respond, even though I'm not fully clear on the question. But to us and to the International Planned Parenthood Federation, so many others who's working in this space, family planning on its own cannot be a response to a climate crisis. Access to sexual and reproductive health and sexual and reproductive health services in the full range of services is a human right, and therefore, of course, family planning is part of it, but it's not a standalone and it's not a response into a mitigation strategy. It's a health right and it's a human right to have access to the full range. Please come again if you have further questions or if I misunderstood the question.
Thank you so much. Do we have any of the speakers want to share before I wrap up?
Yes, just to respond also to one of your questions. I think obviously there's gap in terms of projects on the ground. There's a lot of interest in knowing how to deliver concrete programmatic work on the ground in the countries. There's progress on that front, quite slow, obviously due to resources, but also some of this work around adaptation and resilience. And there's a lot of work that needs to go in terms of getting them right. And I think in the coming years, you would see a lot more projects coming on. From our side as UNFPA, we'll have some projects that will be going on in about 4 or 5 countries, substantive adaptation projects. There would be a bit of pioneering projects. And of course, it has to be very context specific because we work on adaptation and resilience. And I think from what we get, the sense we get from the community, this would increase also across board. I know in the Asia Pacific, there's a lot of work going on around health system strengthening that includes also SRHR, and we expect that the scale of this would increase. And we're also working around being able to provide some information or some knowledge product around how this work can be done. Hopefully, from experiences from partners and also from our own work, we can be able to share some examples of how some of this work can be done in the right way and more concretely at the country level.
Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you so much, Chaguze. So, Ahmad, in
just 3 seconds, how we can get our country on the track simply. Having a partnership with the civil society, have the NGOs with you on the board, have the youth with you, have the women with you, have the UN partners, the UN agencies with you. So this is, you can be on the track. Like if one element is missing, then you won't be in the right tracks. Then you won't be achieving the SDGs, simply the 2030. So if you want really to achieve it, then open your doors for the partnerships. Because without us, nothing will be happening. It's not about the member states. It's also about our nation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mohammed, I think Mohammed agrees with you because when you said partnership, he said, Okay, so that means he definitely is in agreement with the issue of partnership. So thank you so much to our amazing speakers, Deepa, Tahra, Lena, Ahmed, Cheguze, and Natasha. Thank you so much for sharing your insight and the amazing work your institutions and your organizations are doing to advance sexual and reproductive health and rights and climate justice. Thank you so much. And to our amazing audience, thank you so much for spending the 1 hour 30 minutes with us. We look forward to seeing a continuous engagement and conversation about this particular topic, because this is something that needs to keep going on, because we need to create more awareness to ensure that there is more action on the ground, which is more important. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Ismaila, for babysitting. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you.